What if I told you that every day, from the moment you wake up to the moment you close your eyes, you are being spoken to in a language you cannot hear, a language that bypasses logic, slips past reason, and burrows deep into your subconscious? It doesn't use grammar or syntax the way we're taught in school. It doesn't shout or whisper yet. It persuades. It guides your choices, shapes your fears, inflames your desire, and sometimes convinces you that those choices were always yours to begin with. But what if they weren't? Imagine this. You're standing in a grocery store aisle. You glance at 2 jars of peanut butter, one labeled 95% fat-free and the other contains 5% fat. They mean the same thing. Yet most people will choose the first. Why not because of logic, but because of how it feels, how it sounds? This isn't preference, it's programming. That's the power of framing, one of many dialects in the secret language of manipulation. And here's the unsettling part. The more intelligent you are, the more vulnerable you may be. Because manipulation doesn't always target ignorance, it targets confidence. It thrives in certainty. The moment you say, "I'd never fall for that," you're already one step closer to doing exactly that. It's not about making you stupid. It's about making you sure that your thoughts are your own, sure that your conclusions are rational, sure that you are awake while your mind sleepwalks into someone else's design. But let's go back further. Long before social media, marketing gurus, or political campaign strategists, there was rhetoric. The ancient Greeks studied it like a science. Aristotle broke it down into ethos, pathos, and logos, credibility, emotion, logic, 3 tools that, when used with precision, could win wars without a sword. But somewhere along the way, the noble art of persuasion split in 2. One side became the foundation of reasoned debate, the other evolved into something colder, something more surgical. It no longer aimed to inform, it aimed to bypass. Take the illusory truth effect. For example, the more often you hear something, the more likely you are to believe it's true. Not because you investigated it, not because you found evidence, but because your brain, seeking comfort in repetition, confuses familiarity with accuracy. Say something enough times on billboards, in tweets, on morning news shows, and it becomes truth. Not because it is, but because it feels like it is. We laugh at propaganda posters from the past, but our digital age has built a smarter machine. It doesn't scream at you, it echoes, and the echoes, they follow you. Now picture this, a man named Robert walks into a room. He's charming, well-dressed, confident. Within 10 minutes, he's made 3 people agree with him on topics they'd previously felt strongly against, not by presenting facts, not by arguing, but by mirroring their posture, matching their tone, subtly nodding at the right moments. Robert knows something most don't we trust, what feels familiar. We bond with what looks like us. It's called the chameleon effect. And it's just one of the many invisible tools of psychological manipulation used not just by con artists, budbe negociators, advertisers, influencers, and sometimes even friends or lovers. It's not the knife you see. It's the velvet glove you don't. The secret language isn't just spoken, it's felt. We live in a world where images now carry more weight than paragraphs, where brevity isn't just style, it's strategy. Consider the phrase, "if you're not with us, you're against us." It's emotionally charged, binary, irresistible to a tribal brain. It collapses nuance, destroy middle ground, and in doing so, it forces your identity into a box. a choice between belonging and betrayal, these phrases are weapons. They're crafted to elicit a response before you have time to think, before the rational mind catches up. They play a dangerous game with your sense of self. Now ask yourself, have you ever shared a post before reading it fully? Ever nodded in agreement to a quote because it sounded deep even if you didn't understand it? Ever changed your opinion because of a well-edited video? An inspiring soundtrack? Or a clever graphic? That's not weakness. That's humanity. We are creatures of emotion first, logic second. And manipulators know that. They don't convince you to change your mind, they seduce your heart until the mind follows. But here's where it gets even more subtle. Manipulation doesn't always push. Sometimes it pulls. It invites. It creates an illusion of autonomy. You decide, says the advertisement, while steering you toward the only decision it's prepared to accept. Think of default settings on your devices, or opt-out clauses buried in fine print, or the carefully engineered way your phone vibrates. These aren't accidents. They're choices made by people who understand human attention better than we understand ourselves. And they speak fluently in the silent grammar of impulse. Even our fears have a dialect. Have you ever noticed how warnings often highlight what you could lose, rather than what you could gain? Don't miss out. Limited time only. What they're not telling you, this taps into a primal script loss aversion. We hate losing more than we like winning. So, the language of manipulation often masquerades as urgency, scarcity, crisis. It doesn't just inform, it alarms, and in that panic, we comply. But not all manipulation is external. Perhaps the most insidious dialect is the one we speak to ourselves. Self-manipulation. The stories we tell in our heads, the justifications, the edits to memory, the revisionist histories we whisper into the mirror to keep our image intact. I had no choice. They deserved it. I'm doing this for their own good. It's easier to change your memory than to admit contradiction. Easier to reshape reality than to face the pain of being wrong. We become our own persuaders, our own architects of illusion. You see, the secret language doesn't require a speaker. It can arise from silence, from architecture, from design, from rhythm, music. For example, doesn't need lyrics to move you. A major chord lifts your spirit. A minor one breaks your heart. That's not logic. That's resonance. And resonance is a form of persuasion. The same way a cathedral ceiling makes you feel small, or a dimly lit interrogation room makes you feel cornered. Space can speak, so can light, so can silence, and so can power, because at its core, manipulation is about power. Not brute force, but influence. And the most effective form of power is the one that convinces you it doesn't exist. That you're free. That you're in control, like a puppet who thinks he's the puppeteer. This is not a conspiracy theory. It's a commentary on the nature of perception, on how easily we mistake the absence of chains for the presence of freedom. Now consider language itself. The words we use, the labels, the metaphors. Call someone a patriot, and you frame their actions as noble. Call them a radical, and suddenly they're dangerous. Same person, different costume. Labels aren't neutral, they're loaded weapons. A protest becomes a riot. A whistleblower becomes a traitor. A reform becomes a threat. It all depends on the storyteller, and every storyteller has an agenda. But maybe the real question is this: how do you learn to hear a language designed not to be heard? How do you guard yourself against manipulation when it's woven into the very fabric of your environment? The first step is awareness. Not paranoia, not cynicism, but a sober, unflinching awareness that persuasion is everywhere, that the game is always on. And that you, whether you like it or not, are our player. But awareness alone isn't enough. You must also learn to pause, to create space between stimulus and response, to interrogate your own reactions. Why did I agree with that so quickly? Why does that make me angry? Who benefits from me feeling this way? Because that pause, that brief moment of stillness, is your only defense. It's the crack where the light gets in. And yet, even as we speak, someone somewhere is crafting a message, a campaign, a story, one that will bypass your defenses, one that will make you feel before you think, one that will feel like your own conclusion. And when it comes, will you notice, or will you believe, that you were never manipulated at all? There's a curious thing that happens when you ask someone if they've been manipulated. Most will pause, squint slightly, and shake their heads. No, not me. They'll say, I trust my instincts. I trust my judgment. But this response, as noble as it feels, reveals a dangerous blind spot. Because manipulation, when done well, never feels like manipulation. It feels like clarity, like truth, like certainty finally found. And certainty is the perfect disguise. Let's take a step into the realm of politics, not to argue, but to observe. Campaign slogans are not chosen at random. They are A, B tested, audience calibrated, linguistically engineered to evoke action. Make America great again. Yes, we can. Build back better. These phrases don't need to explain anything. They don't present a plan. They present a feeling, nostalgia, hope, restoration. It's not about what they mean, it's about what they imply. And, most importantly, it's about what they allow you to believe you already wanted. Now move from politics to products. You think you buy a car because it's safe, efficient, affordable. But let's be honest, you bought the one that made you feel powerful, or respected, or young again. The glossy ad didn't show crash test results, it showed a man standing tall in a suit, the wind brushing his coat open, stepping into a world that welcomed him with quiet reverence. That wasn't a car, it was a promise. And promises, my friend, are currency in the economy of manipulation. But let's not look outward so fast. Let's bring the lens closer. Have you ever apologized when you didn't do anything wrong? Ever laughed at a joke you didn't find funny? Just to make someone else feel comfortable. Ever said yes when everything in your body was screaming no? These are microtransactions of power. Small manipulations we participate in every day. Sometimes we are the subject, sometimes the object, and very often we are both. Because social survival demands compromise and compromise. When habitual becomes internalized, now enter the family, a mother tells her son, you don't love me anymore, you never call. The words sting. But look deeper. This isn't communication, it's coercion. It's emotional blackmail wrapped in the velvet of parental concern. It's not said with malice, but it's said with purpose. The desired response isn't understanding, it's obedience. The son is nudged not to love, but to act like he loves, and over time, those performances pile up. Love becomes duty, guilt becomes glue, and the language of manipulation becomes indistinguishable from care. But what about in the workplace? Imagine a boss says, we're like family here. It sounds warm. Doesn't it supportive? But what does it imply? Families don't clock out. Families sacrifice. Families stay loyal, even when it hurts. So now, when you work overtime without pay, when you swallow mistreatment, When you stay because you feel guilty leaving, you're not being loyal. You're being manipulated by a metaphor. A single phrase reframes exploitation as devotion. And no policy manual can compete with that. Language, you see, doesn't just describe reality. It defines it. It builds walls, pas illusion. And when wielded with precision, it can rewire your sense of right and wrong. Consider this when someone is called a thug. They become threatening. Call them an activist. And they become brave. Same actions. Different narrative. And in the war of narratives, the side with the simpler story usually wins because the human brain doesn't crave truth. It craves coherence. And manipulators, skilled ones, offer coherence like a drug. Simple answers to complex problems. Villains and heroes. Black and white. A world where everything fits into place, even if the pieces are lies shaved down to size. You've seen this before. In cults, in propaganda, in late-night infomercials that convince you your life will transform if you just buy this one product. Follow this one guru. I read this one book. The illusion of transformation is more powerful than the truth of stagnation. And so we reach. But manipulation doesn't always come from outside sources. Consider the role of memory. Memory is not a recording, it's a reconstruction. Each time we recall a moment, we don't retrieve it, we recreate it. And in doing so, we open it to suggestion. One study showed that simply asking people if they'd ever seen footage of a plane crashing into a building when no such footage existed could convince them they had their brains filled in the gaps. Added color, emotion, certainty, and the false became real. So now imagine this: if someone can control what you remember, they can control how you feel. If they can frame your past, they can shape your future. That's not science fiction. That's marketing. That's politics. That's the news cycle. That's nostalgia, weaponized to create allegiance. When someone says, "Remember when things were better," the question isn't about memory, it's about direction. And direction is everything. Have you ever wondered why certain people, charismatic, magnetic people, seem to carry entire rooms with them? It's not just charm. It's rhythm, pace, pauses. They speak like music. And music bypasses the logical mind. It's not what they say, it's how they say it. A slight nod, a confident breath, a deliberate lean forward. These are not random. These are learnt. The best manipulators are conductors, orchestrating emotion without ever raising their voice. And yet, there is danger in thinking manipulators are always other people, because the system itself can manipulate without faces, without names. Take algorithmic design, social platforms that serve you what you already agree with, news that confirms what you already believe, ads that show you what you just thought of moments ago. It's a world built for comfort, not truth, for addiction, not growth. And in this world, we are not the customer. We are the product, the manipulated, made to feel like the chooser. But don't misunderstand, this is not a call to unplug, to hide, to retreat into paranoia. No, this is a call to see, to look beneath the surface, to ask not just what is being said, but what is being implied. Not just what you believe, but why you believe it. Because if you can trace the thread, you can break the spell. If you can find the frame, you can question the picture. And if you can hear the language, really hear it, then perhaps, just perhaps, you can begin to speak back, not with anger, but with awareness. Let's go deeper. Imagine a stage. On it, a speaker addresses a crowd. He says nothing controversial. Nothing particularly original, but every sentence lands like a revelation. Heads nod, eyes widen, applause erupts. Why? Because the speaker isn't introducing ideas, he's affirming identities. He's not informing, he's reflecting. And the audience isn't clapping for him. They're clapping for themselves. For the version of themselves he allows them to believe in. This is one of the most powerful manipulative tactics in existence. Identity, alignment. You don't need to convince people with facts when you can convince them that their very identity is under threat or under celebration. You don't need to argue points when you can frame the discussion as people like us believe things like this. It's tribal, primal, and devastatingly effective, because if the mind resists logic, the ego rarely resists affirmation. We don't defend ideas, we defend who we believe we are. And when someone wraps a message in the skin of our chosen identity, whether it's political, cultural, spiritual, or even aesthetic, we embrace it instinctively. Not because we've thought it through, but because we fear the cost of not belonging. Social exclusion once meant death for early humans. Today, it simply means being unfollowed, cancelled, mocked, ignored. But the brain reacts the same way. Fear, conform, survive. And this is where manipulation takes a new form, conformity engineering. It's not about changing your mind directly. It's about surrounding you with enough cues, likes, retweets, applause, silence to make you change it yourself. You scroll past a post, it has millions of views, thousands of hearts. You pause. Maybe you watch. You agree. Not because it was more true, but because it was more popular. Popularity is mistaken for proof. The bandwagon isn't a trend, it's a tactic. In fact, sometimes the crowd is the manipulator. There's a term in behavioral psychology, pluralistic ignorance. It describes a situation where everyone privately disagrees, but everyone believes. Everyone else agrees. So no one speaks out. This is how bad ideas survive. This is how dangerous ideologies thrive. Not because they are convincing, but because silence is contagious. And in a world ruled by metrics views, likes, shares, silence feels like consent. So what happens when you finally speak up? The manipulation shifts. Now comes the gaslight. You're overreacting. It's not that deep. Why are you making this a problem? These phrases aren't just dismissive, they're controlling. They deny your perception. They make you question your reality. And if repeated enough, they can make you doubt your own voice. Gaslighting is not about disagreement, it's about erasure. A war, not on what you think, but on your right to think it. But the most dangerous gaslighting isn't interpersonal. It's systemic. It's the curated feed that tells you the world is better than it feels. It's the cheerful headline that masks a devastating truth. It's the performance of progress while structures remain untouched. And when you sense the dissonance, when the facts don't match the feelings you're told, again, that maybe you're the problem, that maybe you just need to adjust your expectations. Breathe. Be grateful. Move on. That, too, is manipulation. Now let's pause for a moment, not to rest, but to consider something deeper. Have you ever wondered why certain ideas just make sense to you? Why some philosophies, some quotes, some narratives feel like they've always been true, even if you just heard them? This is called cognitive resonance. And while it feels like intuition, it often arises from repetition, from childhood, from culture. The ideas that feel natural aren't always correct. They're often just familiar, and familiarity is sticky. It's why national myths persist, why family traditions go unquestioned, Why sayings like boys will be boys or money doesn't grow on trees carry weight. They've been passed down not through reason, but through rhythm, through tone, through trust. But familiarity isn't virtue. It's just comfort with repetition. And when you mistake familiarity for fact, you leave the door wide open for manipulation, cloaked as wisdom. So how do you resist? Not with defiance, but with curiosity. Curiosity is the antidote to manipulation. Not anger, not paranoia. Curiosity asks, what's really happening here? It delays reaction. It creates space for thought. It pauses the script. Because the goal of manipulation is speed, immediate agreement, automatic action. But if you slow the tempo, you change the tune, and that's where your power begins to return. Let's consider one last layer. Storytelling. Humans are wired for story. Not just because stories entertain us, but because they organize meaning. A story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. A problem, a hero, a resolution. When something feels like a story, we believe it more, even if the content is questionable, even if the facts are missing. That's why fake news often spreads faster than real news. It tells a cleaner story. So when you hear something persuasive, something powerful, ask, what's the story here? Who's the hero? Who's the villain? Who benefits from this arc? Because sometimes the storyteller isn't neutral. Sometimes the story is a script, and sometimes you're not the audience. You're the character, and the only way to change the ending is to become the author. Let's peel back the next layer. The one that hides in plain sight tone. Tone is a ghost. You never see it, but you feel it before you understand a word. It determines whether a question feels like curiosity or accusation, whether a suggestion feels like encouragement or command. Two people can say the exact same sentence and leave you with opposite impressions. That's the power of tone. And in manipulation, it's one of the subtlest tools. A leader doesn't need to say obey when they can say we all agree, don't we? A partner doesn't need to demand don't go when they can sigh and whisper, it's fine. Do what you want. The words offer freedom, the tone carries the cage. And when tone and words diverge, you believe the tone. Always. Because your body listens to emotion faster than your mind, translates language. Manipulation doesn't always lie. It just lets tone do the lying for it. But there's something even deeper than tone timing. Manipulation loves timing. It thrives in moments of transition, new job, heartbreak, crisis, illness. When you're unsure of yourself, unsure of the world, that's when a carefully placed voice offers clarity. A mentor, a brand, a belief system, a community. Something to fill the vacuum before you can fill it yourself. This isn't coincidence. It's design. Manipulators wait for your guard to lower, not so they can overpower you, but so they can offer you what seems like refuge. And sometimes, it really feels like safety. That's the brilliance of it. You're not being tricked into fear. You're being soothed into trust. This is why people stay in toxic relationships. Why they return to exploitative workplaces, why they continue to believe systems that never serve them. Because manipulation doesn't always feel like harm. Sometimes it feels like love, like purpose, like home. And when something feels like home, you stop questioning it. You adapt. You decorate the walls. You invite others in. But if manipulation can feel like comfort, what hope do we have? It begins with understanding a simple truth. Not all manipulation is evil. Some of it is accidental, habitual, a coping mechanism, a form of survival passed down through generations. A parent uses guilt because they were raised on guilt. A partner withholds affection because that's how they learn to protect themselves. A friend gaslights without knowing the term. So before we condemn, we must learn to differentiate. Is this manipulation rooted in control or in fear? Is it weaponized or wounded? Because there is another kind of manipulation, the self-directed kind. We manipulate ourselves every day. To survive. To belong. To get through the morning. We tell ourselves we're fine when we're not. We pretend we didn't care when we did. We laugh off what hurt. We fake confidence, fake strength, fake forgiveness, and in doing so, we shape ourselves into a story the world can accept. But at what cost? Every time you shrink your truth to make someone else comfortable, you carve away a piece of your authenticity. And eventually, the version of you that remains is a performance stitched together from everyone else's expectations, a collage of compromises. And the tragedy is that you might not even notice, because the audience applauds, the role earns praise, and the mask becomes indistinguishable from the face. But somewhere, deep inside, the real you knows, and it's waiting, listening. That's where transformation begins. But let's not romanticize awakening. Realizing you've been manipulated by others, by systems, by yourself, is a brutal kind of clarity. It doesn't come with applause. It comes with grief. Grief for the time lost, the choices unchosen, the trust misplaced, the parts of you silenced because you thought they were wrong. This grief is sacred. Don't run from it. Let it burn through the illusions. Let it strip the falsehoods bare, because on the other side of that fire is freedom, not the loud, rebellious kind, the quiet, rooted kind, the kind that no longer needs to prove anything, the kind that listens before reacting, the kind that asks, not, is this what I should believe, but is this what I know, in the deepest part of me, to be true. But even then, the manipulations don't stop. They just evolve. They become subtler, more refined, like a virus adapting to the immune system, so the work doesn't end. The vigilance never fully relaxes, because every story you hear, every headline you read, every post you scroll past, every voice you trust is shaping you, pulling you in one direction or another. And sometimes the most dangerous manipulation isn't the one that tells you what to think. It's the one that tells you when to stop thinking, that you already know enough, that there's no need to question further, that the other side is wrong, evil, stupid, lost. That certainty is virtue. That doubt is weakness. That complexity is inconvenience. These are the signals of stagnation. And stagnation, in a world of manipulation, is surrender. So keep thinking, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable. That discomfort is the sound of your mind stretching, breaking old molds, refusing to be shaped by invisible hands. You won't always get it right. But the pursuit of clarity is itself a form of resistance, a rebellion against the reduction of thought into reaction, of soul into signal. And in that rebellion, you begin to reclaim your mind, not as a fortress, but as a garden, a place where ideas can grow wild but with discernment, where beliefs are planted deliberately, not inherited blindly, where identity is chosen, not assigned, and where the language you speak to yourself is no longer borrowed, but authored. You, the author. At last, there's a moment, quiet and often unnoticed, when a person begins to see through the veil, not all at once, not in a flash of rebellion or a cinematic epiphany, but in a subtle shift, a hesitance before agreeing, a pause before sharing, a faint but growing resistance to the rhythms of the script they've always followed. This moment is not loud. It's not proud. It's the beginning of an inner questioning that rarely speaks aloud but forever changes the way you hear the world. You start to notice how often you're being told what to feel. Not overtly, but through music that swells at just the right moment in a commercial, through color grading that turns a simple scene into a hero's journey, through a speaker's rise in pitch, timed perfectly with applause, manipulation. You realize isn't always malicious, it's just omnipresent. Like air scented just enough to make you lean forward, not because you chose to, but because your biology did. You notice how the word expert is used, not to clarify, but to close the conversation. How controversial frames someone not as thoughtful but as dangerous. How alternative can mean visionary or delusional, depending entirely on the context and who controls it. You begin to hear the unspoken power behind words that were once invisible to you. And this is no longer just about advertising or politics. It becomes personal. You start reflecting on conversations you've had once that left you confused or ashamed or uncertain, without quite knowing why. That moment when someone says, "You're being too sensitive," and suddenly your valid reaction is invalidated. Or you always do this. When you've never done it before, but the phrase carries the weight of certainty, you were nudged, redirected, corrected, not in truth, but in control, and when you questioned it, you felt unreasonable. That's not a coincidence. That's social engineering. Practiced one human at a time. Manipulation doesn't need to be systemic to be effective. It thrives in friendships, in marriages, in meetings. It doesn't require a villain. Sometimes it's woven into the relationship itself, into learned habits and survival strategies, into love languages turned into tools of leverage, into silence used as punishment, into apologies delivered not to repair, but to reset control. But perhaps the most deceptive forms of manipulation are the ones that disguise themselves as care. A boss who tells you not to take that job offer because we're family here. A partner who says they're only jealous because they love you so much. A parent who insists they're just worried about your future. While cutting your dreams at the root, these moments don't feel abusive. They feel familiar, intimate, reasonable. And that's exactly why they work. Because they sound like love. But love, real love, doesn't control, it liberates. This realization can be devastating. To accept that some of the most comforting voices in your life have also, at times, been the most controlling. That the hands that held you may also have shaped you into something more convenient than authentic. That your silence wasn't always your choice, but a conditioned response to someone else's discomfort. But awareness isn't accusation. It's illumination. You can't confront what you cannot see. So you begin to reclaim your voice. Not loudly at first, not dramatically, maybe just by saying, "I don't agree," or "That doesn't sit right with me," maybe by asking a question that disrupts the expected answer, maybe by walking away from a conversation that drains rather than nourishes. These are small revolutions, but revolutions nonetheless. And then, something strange happens. You start to hear the silence between the words. You notice the pacing of someone's pitch, the calculated urgency in their tone. You hear when a compliment is a leash, when advice is a mask, when generosity is a transaction waiting for its return. And you wonder, was it always this obvious, or did I only just learn how to listen? But this new hearing, this clarity comes with responsibility, because once you see manipulation, you also begin to see your own. The times you used flattery to get what you wanted, The moments you stayed silent, not out of kindness, but out of strategy. The praise you gave that wasn't earned. The apologies you withheld to maintain the upper hand. It's not an easy mirror, but it's an honest one. And honesty is where freedom begins. Not the freedom to say whatever you want, but the freedom to no longer live in a story someone else wrote. And the next time you're about to react to a headline, a message, a demand, a performance, you stop, just for a second, and in that second, you ask yourself, what story am I being invited into and who benefits if I believe it? Sometimes the answer is harmless. Sometimes it's benign. But sometimes it reveals a pattern, a script, a loop you've played before. And in that moment of recognition, you hold the power to choose differently. That is how you start to speak a new language. Not the language of manipulation, but the language of sovereignty. There's something sacred about reclaiming your own language, the internal one. The way you speak to yourself when no one else is listening. Because long before the world manipulates you, you often manipulate yourself. You justify, rationalize, contort. You tell yourself that the discomfort is your fault, that the problem is your overthinking, that if you just adjusted a little more, everything would be okay. But who taught you that? And when did you agree? Think back to your earliest memories of discipline, of praise, of love withheld or given conditionally. Did you have to earn approval? Did you learn to read the room before you spoke? Did you become a peacemaker? An overachiever? The good one? The one who never caused trouble? These roles were never neutral. They were survival strategies. And every role contains a script written by others, rehearsed. So often you forgot it wasn't your own voice. And when you stepped outside that role, when you challenged the narrative, did the consequences come swiftly? A withdrawal of affection, a look of disappointment, the sudden coldness of a room that used to feel safe. That's how manipulation breeds itself in silence. It doesn't always need commands. Just reactions. Just subtle shifts. A raised eyebrow. A delayed reply. A change in tone that reminds you, stay in line. And so, you adapted. You made yourself smaller, more agreeable, less threatening. You learned to preface your truths with disclaimers. Maybe I'm wrong. But you learned to apologize for existing in ways that made others uncomfortable. Sorry, I didn't mean to. You turned hesitation into a habit. And every time you did, your voice grew quieter, not because it lacked strength, but because it lacked permission. But now, something within you is starting to rebel. Gently, persistently. You find yourself questioning the invisible rules, the rules that say you should always smile, even when you're angry, that say you should accept advice from those who never listen, that say your worth is tied to how useful, how polite, how pleasant you are to others. These rules were designed to keep you manageable, predictable, acceptable. And perhaps it's time to ask acceptable to whom, for what purpose? Because this is what the secret language of manipulation ultimately does. It teaches you to internalize the controller's voice until it sounds like your own. You no longer need external pressure. You police yourself. You shame yourself. You censor your instincts before they can become actions. It's an elegant system, flawless, efficient, and deeply tragic. But even the most elegant prison can be dismantled if you're willing to notice the bars. And the first bar is usually fear of rejection, of conflict, of being misunderstood. These fears are not irrational. They are inherited. They are taught, and they are weaponized by those who benefit from your silence. But fear, once named, loses its grip. You don't have to eliminate it. You only have to walk through it. You begin by practicing micro-honesty, not portrayal, performative truth-telling, but small, steady admissions of what you really think, what you really want, what you really feel. You start telling people, I need time to think about that, or I'm not comfortable with this. You stop justifying your boundaries. You stop apologizing for your intuition. You let your no be a complete sentence. And you watch, quietly, as the world begins to respond differently. Some will resist. Some will retreat. Some will punish. But some will rise to meet the real you, the one not filtered through manipulation or performance. And in those relationships, you'll taste freedom, not because you're finally in control, but because you've stepped outside the game, because you've recognized that true power is not about getting others to believe you. It's about no longer needing their belief to validate your truth. This is where the manipulation begins to lose its power, not by being defeated, but by becoming irrelevant. You are no longer trying to win the game. You're walking off the board. You are no longer decoding the signals. You are choosing silence over noise, stillness over spectacle, presence over performance. But make no mistake, this clarity has a cost. You'll start to see how much of the world is built on illusion, how often people perform roles rather than live lives, how entire systems depend on your participation in fictions. That consumption brings happiness. That loyalty earns love. That silence equals peace. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. You will begin to crave something real, something unmanipulated, something whole. You may find yourself spending more time in solitude, not out of loneliness, but out of reverence for your inner landscape. You may notice how your thoughts change when no one's watching, how your preferences shift when you're no longer trying to impress. You may begin to recognize your own voice again, not the one shaped by years of pleasing or proving, but the one that existed before the scripts, before the roles, before the noise. That voice is your compass, and it doesn't shout. It whispers. It doesn't convince. It reminds. It doesn't manipulate. It simply is. The journey back to it is not easy, but it is the most honest journey you will ever take. And in a world where everyone is trying to be heard, your power might lie in finally learning how to listen to yourself. And once you do, no manipulator, no system, no story, not even your own past, can ever truly own you again. Now imagine standing in a room full of mirrors. Each one reflects a different version of you, one for your colleagues, one for your family, one for your audience, one for the strangers you pass by. None of them are false. Not exactly, but none of them are whole. Either they are fragments, projections, masks worn not to deceive, but to survive. And the more you adjust yourself to fit each mirror, the more you forget what you looked like before the reflections began. This is the subtle cost of living in a world saturated with manipulation. The line between performance and personality begins to blur. Authenticity becomes an aesthetic. Vulnerability is curated. Honesty is filtered through the lens of relatability. And slowly, the self becomes a brand, something to be optimized, marketed, sold. Even sincerity becomes strategic. And you begin to wonder, is this really me or just a version of me that's easier to consume? You feel it most in moments of stillness. When the notifications stop, when the audience disappears, when the performance pauses, there's a strange silence that follows. Not peaceful, but hollow, a sense that without the reaction of others, your actions lose their meaning. That without validation, value evaporates. This is not vanity. It is conditioning, when your worth has been measured in likes, in affirmations, in applause. The absence of those things can feel like erasure. This is where manipulation achieves its deepest form, not in what it gets you to do, but in what it convinces you to need. You begin to need the noise, to crave the feedback, to equate attention with identity, to mistake engagement for connection, and yet, none of it nourishes. It inflates, yes, but like all things inflated, it's easily punctured. And when it deflates, the emptiness underneath is unbearable. So the cycle continues. Post, perform, refresh, repeat. Not for joy, not for truth, but for reassurance that you still exist in the eyes of the world. But what if you stopped? Not dramatically, not as a rebellion, quietly, privately. What if, just for one day, you chose not to engage in the performance, not to update, not to polish, not to seek approval? What if you allowed yourself to be seen not as impressive, but as real? What would be lost? What would remain? Most people never find out, because to break that pattern is to confront the question, who am I without the script? And that question terrifies. It terrifies because manipulation is comfortable. It offers certainty, predictability, purpose, even when it's artificial, even when it hurts. Letting go of it means stepping into the unknown, into ambiguity, into vulnerability without packaging. And that kind of nakedness, psychological, emotional, spiritual, is something few have ever been taught to welcome. But that unknown space, that's where truth begins to emerge. Not capital T truth, carved in stone, but your truth, messy, evolving, incomplete, but yours, not borrowed, not inherited, not manufactured. And once you start living from that place, even a little, manipulation begins to lose its appeal, because manipulation depends on you not knowing who you are, on you needing something outside yourself to define you. But when you know even a glimpse that you are enough, the bait stops working, the hook doesn't catch, the trap feels obvious, and the game becomes transparent. You may still feel the pull of the performance, the desire to adjust, to be chosen, to be praised. That doesn't go away. But now you see it for what it is, an echo, not a command. You can choose differently. You can return to your center. And you can offer something rare in this world, genuine presence, not as a brand, but as a being, not as a role, but as a soul. This presence is not loud. It is not performative. It does not demand, but its impact is profound. Because in a world full of manipulation, to be real is revolutionary. To be grounded is radical. To be whole is subversive. And when others feel that from you, when they sense that you are not trying to sell them, sway them, win them, they soften. They listen, not always, not immediately, but eventually, because présence crée permission, and the greatest resistance to manipulation is a presence that refuses to participate in the game. That presence can't be faked. It's born from silence, from truth, from the long, slow process of unlearning the lies you were taught to believe about yourself. And the deeper you go into that process, the more fluent you become in the secret language, not to speak it but to hear it, to decode it, to smile gently when it arrives and say, I see you, without reacting, without resisting, without obeying, just seeing. That alone is enough. Because when you can see the language of manipulation for what it is, a performance designed to elicit your compliance, you reclaim the choice of what to do next. And in that choice, quietly, steadily, power returns, and now we arrive at the quiet end of the labyrinth, not with a dramatic reveal, not with fireworks, but with something far more unsettling, a mirror that doesn't distort or flatter or lie, a mirror that simply reflects. And as you look into it, really look, you begin to see the shape of every story you've believed, every behavior you've absorbed, every narrative you've played a role in without even realizing. It's disorienting at first, because this reflection doesn't show you as you've always been told you are. It shows you as you are when no one's watching, when no one's nudging, when no one is whispering expectations into your ear like background music. It's raw. It's real. It's you before the edits. And in this moment, a quiet thought begins to rise. What if I've never actually made a fully free choice in my life? Not because you were weak, but because you were swimming in a current so powerful, so pervasive, that you didn't even know it was water. You were taught how to love, how to mourn, how to celebrate, how to hate, how to define success, how to define failure, how to measure your worth, how to rank your beauty, how to calculate your dignity based on things outside your control. And each of those definitions came from somewhere, someone, a culture, a machine, a memory, a need. But none of it was neutral. Even the things that felt like your own might have been placed there by hands you'll never see. So what now? Now that you can't unknow what you've come to see, now that you've felt the patterns shift beneath your feet, the answer isn't destruction. It isn't to burn it all down. It isn't to live in suspicion or retreat into isolation. That's just another trap, another manipulation, disguised as liberation. No. The answer is far more difficult, and far more beautiful. It is to begin again, to ask questions without demanding immediate answers, to live in the tension between knowing and not knowing, to accept that freedom is not a destination, but a practice. That authenticity is not a possession, but a process. You begin by listening more than speaking, by noticing before reacting, by choosing what nourishes instead of what performs. You begin by slowing down enough to ask yourself, why did I just do that? Who am I trying to please? Who am I trying to prove something to? What if I didn't? You begin by sitting with discomfort long enough to hear what it's trying to teach you, instead of rushing to silence it with noise, or numbing, or the next distraction designed to keep you comfortably asleep. Because the truth is, most manipulation doesn't want to control your body. It wants to control your attention, your belief, your story, and if it can own your story, it can own you. But you, in this moment, can decide to reclaim it. Not perfectly, not all at once, but one word at a time, one choice at a time, one breath at a time. And maybe, just maybe, the next time a voice tells you what to believe, how to feel, what side to choose, what truth to accept, you'll hear it for what it is, a suggestion, not a command. You'll pause, you'll feel the pull, but you won't move until you know it's yours. And in that pause, in that sacred, defiant moment of clarity, you will do something most people never even realize they're allowed to do. You will choose, not what's popular, not what's expected, not what's easiest, but what is real. And that, in a world fluent in the secret language of manipulation, is the most revolutionary act of all.